And the BBC is still refusing to call Hamas terrorists, and now even the former Prime Minister of Israel has called out the corporation live on air. Take a look at the astonishing spat yesterday between Naftali Bennett and the Beebs presenter Victoria Derbyshire.
And I understand that BBC has taken a side of on the Gazan side, because all your questions are only about the Gazan civilians.
That's not
you
true.
Haven't asked one question.
That's not
you haven't
true.
asked one question
I began
about
by
those children. From the very beginning of this interview, you just are asking me about them.
Mr.
But
Bennett,
it seems
that
that
is
you care
not true.
little about our side. Oh, it is. You keep on caring only about one side, but that is the BBC way. And if you think there's a balance here between two equal sides, then you are lacking moral clarity.
Meanwhile, the Israeli president is not happy either, slamming the BBC's reporting as atrocious. Even Rishi Sunak throwed a bit of shade in the BBC's direction. Take a listen.
The explosion was likely caused by a missile, or part of one, that was launched from within Gaza towards Israel. The misreporting of this incident had a negative effect in the region, including on a vital US diplomatic effort and on tensions here at home.
So has the corporation brought shame on Britain? Let me know your thoughts. Mark at gbnews.com or at gbnews on Twitter. And do vote in the poll. But to debate this now, I'm delighted to welcome former BBC producer John Mayer, ex-Coronation Street star Charlie Lawson, and former BBC series producer and the star of the excellent YouTube channel Flooded, Craig Duncan. Craig, can I start with you? Your reaction to the BBC's reporting of this Israel crisis over the last 2 weeks?
Well, I've been a little bit shocked because they seem to don't know what a terrorist is, or they seem to have lost the ability to look up definitions. I've got with me, Mark, when I was at the BBC, we were all given this book. Can you see that? It is the Producer Guidelines, and this was a Bible for us. And in it, at the very, very beginning, the first thing we have to talk about, or they had to tell us, or teach us about, was impartiality. And then there's a section on the inside called number 15, terrorism and national security. There's even a section about how to interview terrorists. So I'm not quite sure how they've forgotten that they wrote that. And where they're at now, because they seem to be just in complete denial that terrorists exist.
OK, well, John, you disagree with what Craig's just said. Why?
This man is talking complete tosh. This is the BBC. It's not the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation. It's the BBC. And in my opinion, they're doing a cracking job in Israel. And you know what? For the first time in my memory, they're admitting mistakes. They admitted that they got the hospital wrong, and they've apologised for that. They admitted a few other things. By the way,
they got the hospital wrong because of Israel bias. They saw an exploded hospital and thought that's the Israelis. They made a judgment rather than a journalistic stating a journalistic fact.
I've heard the number 2 in news apologise for that publicly last week.
Born out of prejudice.
Not born out of prejudice, born out of time constraints and
it doesn't take long to say we don't know who bombed the hospital.
Mark, which organisation has a journalist in Gaza? The BBC. He's not very good, but they have a journalist there. Nobody else does. The ITV are doing very well. So is the BBC. You know, the BBC has done really, really well. Frontline reporting in a bloody difficult situation. I will criticise one thing. I thought the interview with the Archbishop of Canterbury last night was a bit arsenic, frankly, and they shouldn't have used it. But they are, by and large, they put their stars there, and the stars are performing over and over again. And you know what? They're not calling them terrorists. They're saying the UK government calls them terrorists. They don't use the word terrorist as coming from the BBC. Quite rightly too.
Gaslighting Israeli victims. Listen, Charlie, let's talk about this. By the way, GB News has excellent representation in Israel. Charlie Peters has been broadcasting live from Israel.
How many reporters have you got there? How many reporters?
Charlie is all you need, because you get one Charlie Peters is as good as 10 BBC journalists. Why? Because he tells the truth and he's not biased and he's not anti-Israel.
Right, it's hardly journalism.
There you go. Oh, listen, Charlie Peters didn't get it wrong about who exploded a hospital in Gaza. Charlie, your reaction to the BBC's coverage. Have you worked for the BBC much yourself?
Yeah, just for about 42 years, mate. And I would have to say that the ground crew, so to speak, and the cast, I've worked with Republicans, Palestinian supporters a lot, and they'll absolutely be fine when you're making the programme. But there definitely is an editorial bias. There's no doubt about that. You two fellas, especially you, John, would be old enough to remember whenever we had Martin Bell in Northern Ireland, and the people of Northern Ireland, the Protestant Unionist community considered him completely biased, and he was shafted. He was done for it. You know what I mean? Look, the BBC, I mean, John Humphreys, for God's sake, he was running the world at One, and I think he was brave enough and open enough to come out and say that there was educationally a political slant or whatever. We've all known that about the BBC.
So should the BBC call the IRA terrorists? Did the BBC call them terrorists? The BBC was straight down the line in Northern. I know, I worked for them there. They were straight down the line.
Well done, as they are in Israel. Darling. Good for you. I lived there too.
Yes, well, I lived there as well, on and off. But
Wait, John, I'm just telling you how the unionist stroke loyalist people felt about the BBC. Not what you think about the BBC. You were employed by them, mister. I'm talking about how the people on the ground felt about your organisation, okay?
So it wasn't the Unionist Broadcasting Corporation, nor is it the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation. It's the BBC, remember.
Well, the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a political union. The BBC is the national broadcaster. Craig, what does this coverage tell us about the culture of the BBC?
You see, I think that the thing is, I think people in the UK love the BBC. We love the BBC, but we are furious with them because they seem to be, the custodians of the BBC currently seem to be undermining it and what it used to stand for. I've interviewed people to come and work at the BBC, and I've had superiors next to me who have overridden my decisions, because I've interviewed people who took to be directors on shows, and they've had no they've demonstrated no ability to be, or qualifications to be decent directors for what we were looking for. And his argument to me later on was that we should employ this person because she's funky. She's got a funky look. She seems funky, and we've seen it. We've seen the BBC went through a huge problem. They were really struggling. So they were jihading back in the 90s because channels like Channel 5 were coming to fruition and Channel 4 were doing well. Channel 4 were very, very edgy. The BBC was seen as being a bunch of stuffed shirts and very old-fashioned. So they tried to be a little bit more sort of funky, I guess, is the word that they started using. And as such, they started employing freelancers from sort of in the independent sector who came in. They didn't care about this. This doesn't exist anymore. This isn't given to staff anymore. This is just basically, thrown away, and everyone's using the website now.
Let Craig finish.
So people aren't really sure how to.
Craig, finish your point.
I think people at the BBC, because everyone's a freelancer as well, and the BBC isn't really responsible for making a lot of the shows that it puts on air. It's all being made by independent production companies who don't care about the guidelines that I've just shown you. And as a result of a lot of the independent sector coming in, it has become, unfortunately, a very sort of left-wing biased channel. And we don't hear any pushback against the BBC from the left. We don't hear the left retweeting.
Okay. Now, John, the clock's against us, but Mark Dolan, GB News, we're all about balance. Can you have closing thoughts from you, John, if you may?
Yeah, I mean, this man specialises in talking nonsense. Every independent producer has to abide by the producer guidelines. I know, I've done it. They have to, and they have a BBC person editorial responsible.
Okay.
The BBC is impartial. It's the British Broadcasting Corporation, not the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation, nor the Unionist Broadcasting Corporation.
Well, I think it is the Unionist Broadcasting Corporation, but I beg to differ with you on that one. Listen, Craig, Charlie, John, I wish we had longer. What a debate. But let's go to the BBC now, who have said our starting point is always impartiality, and we take that incredibly seriously. That's why we take so much effort to get our coverage of significant and complex world events right. In amongst thousands of hours of news broadcasting, there will always be some errors. Where we do get things wrong, we always hold up our hands, as we did this week when one of our correspondents was wrong to speculate, along with others, about the cause of the Al-Ali hospital explosion. Well, your verdict is in. 91% of you agree that the BBC has brought shame on Britain, whilst 9% say it has not.